Jonathan felt the coolness of the autumn air on his neck long after he left the truck behind. The shadows of the pines stretched out like crooked fingers, casting shimmering outlines on the ground. His plan was simple: to spend a few days alone in the heart of the Blackthorn Forest, a patch of wilderness that few people dared to cross, to find some peace and quiet. He had hiked alone before, and although his family and friends had warned him about this forest, he ignored their prejudices. He was tired of well-trodden paths and fenced-in campsites. He wanted adventure. At first, the pine-lined trail was wide, and the sunlight still streamed through the canopy overhead. But soon that warmth faded. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to transform into a completely different realm. The scent of damp pine needles and rich clay soil overwhelmed his senses. Birdsong became rare and then disappeared altogether. It seemed as if the forest itself had taken a long, slow breath and was holding its breath. Every time Jonathan stopped, he noticed an unsettling silence, as if the landscape was straining to hear his every step. He checked his compass, trying to make sure he was still following the barely visible trail marked on the map. But the deeper he went, the less the compass reassured him. There was a strange flicker in the arrow, as if it was trying to deviate from something. Dark green branches clustered together above him, weaving a canopy so dense that the last rays of the sun barely made it through. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, bending with every slightest change in light. Once he caught the echo of what he thought was laughter. But it wasn't human laughter, it was distant and distorted, like a cassette player running on half-discharged batteries. The sound echoed among the trees, and then abruptly cut off, leaving only silence. A chill ran down his arms, and he involuntarily sped up his pace, hoping to find a less claustrophobic section of the trail. But the path narrowed, and soon it turned into a ribbon of mud snaking between mossy rocks and tangled roots. Jonathan tried to hold his breath. It was just the natural silence of the forest, he thought. His heart was pounding so hard he swore the whole forest could hear him. His intuition told him something was wrong. He found himself thinking about old superstitions, that some forests were home to restless spirits, that he shouldn't stray from the marked paths, that the forest had a mind of its own. He shook his head, trying to push the disturbing thoughts away, and continued walking. Daylight was fading, and he needed to find a place to camp before dark. He had no desire to pitch his tent in complete darkness, but when he looked around for a clearing, he found nothing. The pine trees were getting closer and closer, and the mossy undergrowth was getting thicker and twisted. It didn't just make it harder to walk, it seemed alive. The vines seemed to cling to his ankles. When the last golden rays of the sun disappeared behind the trees, Jonathan was already in twilight. In that special twilight that painted everything in uncertain shades. That's when he heard it, a soft whirring. At first, it was barely noticeable, like a distant generator running in a constant rhythm. He stopped, trying to identify its source, but the sound seemed to drift between the pines, never staying in one place long enough for him to concentrate. Every time he thought he had found it, the humming would slip away to another part of the forest. His breathing became shallow. Parting the curtain of hanging moss, Jonathan found himself in a small clearing, more like a gap in the forest than a real clearing. It offered a piece of open sky overhead. The moon had risen, almost full and incredibly large, flooding everything around him with a cold silvery light. For a moment, relief filled his chest. Finally, a place to set up camp. But that feeling evaporated when he realized how quiet everything had remained. Not a single cricket chirping, not a single rustle of a nocturnal animal. Only this soft hum, which now seemed closer. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding shy and small. The forest responded with silence. There was an uneasy tension in the air, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, deciding whether to let him continue or swallow him whole. The sensation was overwhelming, a tangle of fear, curiosity, and something inexplicable, like a thick cloak draped over his shoulders. His instinct screamed at him to turn around and follow the faint trail back to his truck. But that was miles away. Night had fallen, and trying to go back in the dark seemed as foolish an idea as moving forward. He forced himself to cut through the growing knot of fear and focused on gathering enough dry wood for a fire. The act of movement, the routine work, gave him a sense of normalcy. However, while he was preparing the campsite, the buzzing did not stop. It seemed to trace the edges of the clearing, invisible but ever-present. And though he tried to ignore it, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something tied to the roots of these ancient pines, drawn to the man wandering where he shouldn't be. Jonathan stopped to listen again, but the humming had receded, leaving only the heavy silence of the forest. He couldn't help but think that whatever was hiding in this forest had deliberately stepped back, waiting for the right moment to pounce on him. When he lit his small fire, a shimmering orange glow danced on the twisted trunks, carving shifting shapes in the darkness. Jonathan gasped for air, his chest tightening with anxiety he couldn't yet name. He would soon learn that the forest itself was the least of his worries. Something else, something much older and infinitely more dangerous was hiding in those trees, and it was already watching him from the shadows. Jonathan threw another stick into the fire and watched the sparks rise into the cold night air. The moon remained bright and cloudless, making it impossible to ignore the silhouette of the trees that stood around him like silent sentinels. The faint buzzing sound, whatever it was moving away, but it never completely disappeared. Instead, it seemed to hover over the clearing, teasing his mind, waiting for him to let his guard down. He tried to concentrate on practical things, unrolling his sleeping mat, checking his supplies, scanning the map by the light of the fire. But the flicker of movement at the edges of his vision made him look over his shoulder again and again. Each time he saw nothing but the changing play of shadows cast by the dancing flames. But every rustle in the bushes made his heart leap out of his chest. Around midnight, as he was about to go to bed, he heard something, a soft grinding sound, like an animal being wounded. He froze in place, ears perked up. The forest around him was so eerily quiet that the sound seemed incredibly close. The shrubbery parted with a sudden crack, as if something large was pushing through it. Jonathan clutched the flashlight tighter. When the sound subsided, he walked to the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding under his ribs. The flashlight's beam revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just dark trunks and twisting tendrils of moss. He exhaled a shaky breath and stepped back, returning to the fire. Perhaps some animal had passed nearby, disturbed by the glow and the unfamiliar smell of a human. It was enough to convince him that he should try to get some rest, no matter how hard it was. Inside the tent, the warmth of the fire seemed distant, more like a memory than a source of comfort. He closed the flap, leaving only a small opening for fresh air, and climbed into his sleeping bag. The wind picked up, turning the branches above into light claws that scraped across the sky. The buzzing had receded, but it was still within earshot. He couldn't help but wonder if it was some kind of natural phenomenon, perhaps underground air currents or the vibration of the wind through the pines. He kept telling himself this, repeating it in his head, until fatigue finally pulled him into sleep. The sleep, however, was far from peaceful. Early in the morning, he dreamed that he was standing in the same clearing, but not alone. Tall, spindly figures emerged from the darkest corners, their outlines made up of swirling shadows. Their eyes glowed with a faint green phosphorescent light and stared at him in silence. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, and the only sound was that damned buzzing, now deeper, more resonant. When he blinked, the figures were right next to him, their outstretched arms reaching for him. A putrid smell, a mixture of rotting leaves and something much worse, filled his nostrils. Jonathan shivered, tangled in the sweat-soaked blanket. He lay in the dark, disoriented by the vividness of his dream. His heart was pounding, and it took him a moment to realize that the buzzing was back, closer and more insistent than ever. He felt for the flashlight, its beam trembling as it bounced off the tent walls. The fire outside had long since burned down to embers. A single thought pulsed through his mind. There's something out there. He held his breath and listened. Footsteps, soft but cautious, crunched the pine needles behind his tent. Impossible, he thought. It could have been an animal. But the footsteps sounded too measured, too cautious. Then they stopped. There was absolute silence. The forest waited, as if some creature, whatever was wandering there, was frozen, listening for him to make a move. Jonathan's pulse was pounding so loudly in his ears that he almost convinced himself it was the only sound. He thought about unzipping the tent just an inch, enough to peek outside. But fear pinned him to the ground, rooting him in place like a helpless prey. For long, agonizing minutes he remained motionless, barely daring to breathe. Finally, the footsteps came again, this time moving away. They went deeper into the dense thickets of trees, and he heard bushes rustling in the distance. The buzzing disappeared with them and was replaced by silence, so complete that it vibrated with tension. He wondered if he was really alone, or if something had decided to bide its time. Pressed against the floor of his tent, Jonathan tried to steady himself. Every muscle in his body urged him to flee, to run back toward the main road or at least to the truck. But he was in the midst of unfamiliar terrain, with no trail visible in the dark. It was madness to attempt an escape without daylight, especially if something was stalking him. Gripping the flashlight in one trembling hand, he realized that this was no ordinary camping trip. Whatever roamed these woods wasn't just an animal. It felt like the forest itself was alive with intelligence, an ancient cunning that far exceeded any superstitions he'd ever heard. As he lay there, wide-eyed and exhausted, he knew dawn couldn't come soon enough, and he had a sinking feeling that daylight might offer little reassurance, because some things don't vanish with the sun. At dawn, Jonathan woke up to find the world bathed in a pale, colorless light. Relief pervaded him. He had somehow survived the night unscathed, but it was a fragile relief, quickly drowned out by the lingering fear of the footsteps he heard outside his tent. His heart still pounded at the memory. He stepped out cautiously, stepping into the dim light of the early morning. The air was damp and cold, and fog swirled over the ground. With slow, deliberate movements, he folded his tent and covered the remains of the fire with ashes. He wanted to leave this clearing behind as soon as possible, but the memory of these steps, and that unearthly buzzing, kept him busy and made him cautious. He planned to return to the marked path he had left the day before. But in the daylight, the forest looked strange and unfamiliar, every trunk and branch bent in the thin fog. When he looked at his compass, the arrow fluttered between two directions, as if it couldn't find true north. Panic rose in him, but he suppressed it, telling himself that compasses could malfunction or the metal in the area could knock him off. And yet, a chill pierced the back of his neck. He chose a direction that seemed right to him and moved forward. Half an hour later, he came across a faded, lichen-covered trail marker leaning precariously against a rock. Relief relaxed his tense shoulders, but this feeling was short-lived. When he reached the marker, he noticed something stuck to the trunk of a nearby pine tree, a small, pale object hanging from a piece of rope. His pulse quickened as he recognized it as the skull of a small animal, possibly a rabbit, bleached white and cleaned clean. It looked neatly placed, like some kind of primitive totem. Jonathan crouched down to examine it, a mixture of disgust and fascination fighting in his mind. Who or what could have done such a thing, and why? He had heard of strange forest dwellers making amulets or creepy ornaments, but he had always thought of them as campfire stories. This was undoubtedly real. A new wave of apprehension pushed him forward, his feet sped up, as if the forest itself were driving him away from this eerie signpost. Moving deeper, he avoided monstrous tree trunks and gnarled roots. The fog began to clear, revealing a maze of broken branches and rotten logs. From time to time he caught a fleeting movement out of the corner of his eye, a silhouette flashing by, a flash of pale skin, or perhaps the flick of an animal's tail. But every time he turned his head, there was nothing but swaying leaves. "You're letting the shadows follow you," he told himself. At one point, he nearly tripped over a half-buried trap, a loop of wire fastened between two roots. It was obviously man-made and skillfully placed. It took his breath away. This forest was not as deserted as he had assumed. Someone, or something, had set traps, and they weren't for small game. The tension in the wire indicated that it could hold something, or someone, much larger. He felt like an intruder who had invaded the land with hidden, silent guards. It was then that the buzzing returned, faint at first and then growing louder at odd intervals. He froze, scanning the trees, trying to find its source. The feeling of wrongness returned, stronger than before. The hum seemed to resonate in his chest, vibrating his ribcage. He could almost swear that it formed a pattern, a pulsating frequency that rose and fell in undulations. With each crescendo, the forest around him stood still, as if every living thing was pausing to pay attention to him. Then Jonathan saw her, a figure slipping between the pines, almost lost in the fog. It moved smoothly, gliding rather than walking. Jonathan was seized with panic. He ducked behind the wide trunk of a tall tree, all thoughts scattered, except for the desire to hide. His heart pounding, he risked a quick glance. The figure drifted closer, still partially hidden by the fog. What he could make out, the long, gnarled limbs and unnatural posture, was enough to make his mind tremble. He clutched at the bark, blood pounding in his ears, as the figure tilted its head toward him, stopping as if it sensed his presence. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He pressed himself against the tree, trying to make himself invisible. Seconds stretched into eternity. The buzzing reached a fever pitch, and he closed his eyes, praying that the figure would move on. A sudden gust of wind rustled the branches, blowing the fog aside. When he finally dared to look again, the figure was gone, but the forest had grown even darker, as if it had become a cage. A single thought dominated his mind. He is being hunted. And with this realization came another, much worse one, that whoever or whatever was chasing him, he was not alone in this forest. Something else was there, too, probably just as terrifying, waiting to close the circle. Jonathan forced himself to breathe. He had to find a way out. But with every step deeper into the desert, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was leading him astray, leading him down paths that looked safe only to close in on him. Each new discovery, shabby totems, hidden traps, shimmering shadows, seemed to him to be part of some eerie puzzle that he had fallen into against his will. And no matter how fast he walked, he could not outrun the whispering of the leaves, the swaying of the moss, the shimmering of figures in the fog. The forest may have been silent, but it was certainly alive, and Jonathan was about to learn just how deadly its patience could be. Jonathan waded through the twisting trunks, desperately trying to escape the forest's suffocating embrace. Every turn of the trail brought him closer to panic. Every strange crack or rustle shook his nerves. The compass needle still flickered erratically in his hand, and a deep fear twisted in his stomach that he might never find a way out. At noon he came upon a clearing littered with scattered bones, the remains of animals half buried in mud and moss. In the middle stood a rickety structure made of branches, something that could have been a crude shelter or shrine. Then he heard the buzzing again, piercing his ears like an unholy chant. A cold wind blew through the pines, stirring the hanging moss. As Jonathan stepped back, he saw a silhouette crouching at the far edge of the clearing, its unnaturally long limbs wrapped around a fallen log. His stomach fluttered. Whatever it was, it seemed almost unbearable. A humming sound flared up, pulsing through the air, and the figure unfolded, stretching to an impossible height. Jonathan turned and ran, branches slapping him in the face. His own ragged breathing drowned out the pounding in his ears. But through it all, he could feel this presence patient, relentless, ready to pounce at any moment. Jonathan's heart hammered as he fled the clearing, the forest warping around him with every step. The humming had returned, a sinister pulse that seemed to corral him deeper, twisting every path into a dead end. At last he spotted an old, sagging cabin lurking behind a row of pines. Though every instinct screamed to keep moving, exhaustion and fear shoved him inside. Broken furniture and cobwebs greeted him, but he found the walls more comforting than the open forest. Then a heavy thump rattled the door, something testing the barrier. The humming rose to a fever pitch, and for a moment, he feared the flimsy walls would burst. But just as suddenly as it began, the assault stopped, leaving a silence more unnerving than the noise. Knowing he was cornered, Jonathan slipped out into the moonlit night. The forest felt denser, as if it were closing in, until he noticed a slope leading up to a rocky outcrop. Scrambling over loose stones, he glimpsed the distant glow of a road below. A piercing shriek ripped through the trees behind him. Dark shapes materialized at the ridgeline. With one desperate lunge, he reached the road and collapsed. Under the cold moon, he realized he'd escaped the forest, but a piece of its horror clung to him, an echo of that humming and the memory of those hideous silhouettes among the pines. He had survived, but he knew he'd never be free of what lurked in those ancient, haunted woods.